One of the most horrific crimes against humanity committed by the Third Reich was undoubtedly the establishment of concentration camps, both within its own territory and in the occupied countries. The names Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Auschwitz still evoke a shudder even today. The dismantling of the camp system occurred in parallel with the collapse of the Nazi regime. Thousands of prisoners with tears in their eyes welcomed the liberators, symbolizing their freedom from terrible suffering. Yet the memories of humiliation and torment endured by these unfortunate individuals remained etched in their minds for a long time. The construction of the Ravensbrook camp, which later became one of the largest in terms of the number of inmates, was personally overseen by Heinrich Himmler. According to his plan, the future prison was intended solely for women. During their sentences, they were engaged in work at a textile production facility within the camp, specifically sewing clothes for the prisoners. The barracks, where the first groups of prisoners were accommodated, were constructed and completed in May 1939. They were designed to accommodate 6,000 people, and initially, only German female prisoners were brought there. However, the expansionist policy required an increase in prison capacity. Approximately 900 women were selected from the inmates to construct additional barracks and a barracks for soldiers. As new facilities were put into operation, the number of prisoners grew rapidly, now including not only German women, but also females of other nationalities who were being brought in large numbers from the occupied territories. Ravensbrook soon expanded into a vast network comprising transit camps, death camps, forced labor camps, and so-called sub-camps. The number of prisoners exceeded 10,000 by 1943, and by 1944 it surpassed 15,000. The majority were women, but special barracks were also created for men, women, and children. As the number of prisoners increased, the conditions of detention and the treatment of inmates steadily deteriorated. All newcomers to the camp were first taken to the courtyard for an initial examination, where they were completely undressed, regardless of the weather. The medical examination was conducted in a very rough manner, and the gynecological examination was particularly humiliating, causing severe pain to the girls. After the allocation of accommodations, the harsh camp routine began. The girls were woken up at 4 a.m., given a drink of alcohol-laced coffee, and driven into the courtyard for roll call. During this time, the work assignments for the day were announced and inspections were conducted. In some cases, these inspections were deliberately prolonged, especially in bad weather, causing some women to collapse due to the prolonged standing. The guards, sometimes with dogs, would immediately attack and brutally beat them. Often, these victims were unable to work anymore and were soon sent to the gas chamber. After roll call, the girls were sent to their work assignments. Shifts typically lasted between 12 and 14 hours, with only one break for lunch. This meal consisted of a so-called soup, a half-liter of water with potato peels, and even this meager ration was only provided once a day. Night shifts were conducted without any breaks or food. In addition to the mandatory inspections at the beginning and end of the day, there were also additional checks, such as inspections of the prisoner's appearance. Although uniforms were issued upon arrival, according to the regulations, they were to be kept clean and tidy at all times. Dirty shoes and torn clothing resulted in additional punishments. The prisoners were beaten with whips, locked in solitary confinement, and deprived of dinner. These torments were aimed not only at physical, but also at psychological impact on the inmates. Broken and oppressed women became more submissive and controllable, which was well understood by the commandant and the guards, who were selected from individuals who had undergone special training programs for working in concentration camps. Their primary task was to ensure strict adherence to the unbearable regime, which they excelled at. The real nightmares for the unfortunate prisoners began when a special medical complex was opened on the territory of the camp. The medical staff there was not engaged in treating the prisoners, but in conducting brutal experiments. They tormented people to death, and their primary goal was to study the body's reaction to various injuries and diseases. To this end, the subjects were deliberately injured, and the experiments were often taken to the point of death. One of the first experiments was the study of the body's reaction to the introduction of foreign objects into wounds. The skin on the calves was cut, and initially, pathogenic bacteria were introduced into the wound as a reaction trigger, followed by sawdust or broken glass. This fully replicated the model of a combat wound. The doctors then carefully observed the inflammatory processes and applied various treatment methods. The fact that the girls experienced terrible suffering during these experiments and that anesthesia was prohibited did not concern anyone. Considerable attention was also paid to studying the endurance of the prisoners. They were selected into groups based on age and physical characteristics and forced to perform numerous strenuous exercises. The load was gradually increased until the subjects collapsed and the results were recorded. Those who were exhausted and therefore less fit for work were sent to the gas chambers. One of the most brutal experiments was the limb transplantation procedure. It involved amputating legs or arms and transplanting them to other subjects, with little to no anesthesia, causing unbearable suffering. After the experiment, the subjects were given lethal injections. The infamous German practicality manifested itself in another way. Often, new female prisoners who were pregnant were brought to the camp. The local doctors promptly developed a course to study methods of abortion at various stages of pregnancy. In many cases, the fetus was still alive at the end of the experiments, but was immediately destroyed. The Nazis, faithful to the idea of creating conditions for the non-proliferation of unwanted nations, made Ravensbrook one of the main platforms for testing various sterilization methods. One of the mandatory conditions was that the subjects should recover relatively quickly and return to work. Initially, injections of Novocaine, barium sulfate, and formalin were tested, but the women did not recover from these drugs. Then, they tried using X-rays, which led to radiation exposure, but was considered more effective overall. This is far from a complete list of all the horrific and inhuman experiments conducted. There were experiments on freezing to better understand the reanimation process, nerve and muscle tissue transplantation, and many others. Often, the doctors killed sick prisoners with lethal injections or gave them a pill that was supposedly a cure. In total, during the existence of the camp, no less than 70,000 people perished within its walls, and at least a quarter of them were tortured to death during the cruelest experiments. The camp firmly took one of the first places in the level of prisoner mortality, second only to the concentration camp of Flachsenberg. In the last days of April, the leadership of Ravensbrook began to receive disheartening news. The Red Army continued to confidently defeat the remnants of the Wehrmacht and rapidly advanced westward. The commandant and the camp garrison did not wait for the appearance of Soviet soldiers and hastily evacuated about 20,000 prisoners to Malchow, one of the external corps of Ravensbrook. Some prisoners managed to escape, and on April 30th, the Soviet troops that arrived in Malchow liberated the remaining prisoners.